I never thought a simple wheelchair ramp would turn our neighborhood into a battleground, but that was before the HOA decided to make my sister their next target. It all started with a bright yellow notice taped to our front door. I recognized it immediately. Another violation letter from the Homeowners Association, signed by the one and only Patricia Monroe, the HOA president. It was the fourth one this month, all centered around one thing: my sister Emily's wheelchair ramp. I crumpled the paper in frustration, tossing it onto the growing pile of notices we had collected over the past few weeks. Emily, who had just come home from a long day of work, wheeled herself up the ramp with practiced ease. She looked at me with tired eyes, noticing my clenched jaw and the discarded notice. "Another love letter from Patricia?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with exhaustion. Emily never let things get to her. Not the car accident that had put her in a wheelchair a year ago, not the endless work meetings that drained her energy, and certainly not the power-hungry woman across the street who seemed determined to make her life miserable. I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temples. "Yeah, apparently. Your ramp is ruining the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood." I glanced out the window, where Patricia stood in her driveway, phone in hand, snapping photos of our house, as if she were collecting evidence for some crime. Her manicured nails, designer sunglasses, and perfectly tailored suit made her look more like a high-profile attorney than an HOA president. I had no doubt she enjoyed the little power she had over the neighborhood. What frustrated me the most was that we had followed every rule. We hired a licensed contractor, got all the necessary permits, and even painted the ramp a neutral gray to match the house. But Patricia wasn't satisfied. She wanted it gone. Emily had refused to make a big deal out of it, saying we should handle it through proper channels. "We'll appeal to the HOA board," she had said. "We have rights." What she didn't realize was that Patricia controlled the board, and no amount of legal paperwork would change her mind. A few days later, things escalated. I woke up early to the sound of hushed voices outside. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Patricia standing with two men in suits, pointing at our ramp and speaking in low tones. One of them jotted notes in a small book while the other took pictures. My stomach twisted with unease. Emily had already left for a morning meeting, so she wasn't here to see what was happening. As I stepped outside, Patricia's eyes flicked toward me, her lips curving into a smug smile. "Good morning," she said sweetly, but I could hear the condescension in her tone. I folded my arms. "What's going on?" She didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. "Just ensuring community standards are upheld," she replied. "We've had several complaints about the obstruction in your driveway." I clenched my jaw. "You mean my sister's wheelchair ramp?" Patricia's smile didn't waver. "Rules are rules." Then she turned to the men in suits. "We'll proceed as planned. Demolition is scheduled for tomorrow morning." I felt my heart slam against my ribs. "You're demolishing it?" Patricia sighed, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "It's in violation of HOA guidelines. We sent multiple notices, and since there's been no compliance, the board has unanimously approved its removal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's illegal. We have permits." She waved a dismissive hand. "City permits don't override HOA regulations." Then, with a satisfied nod to her associates, she turned and strutted back toward her house, heels clicking against the pavement. Panic coursed through me. I grabbed my phone and called Emily, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course, she was in a closed-door budget meeting today, completely unreachable. My hands shook as I flipped through our paperwork, rereading every permit, every approval. We had done everything right, but it didn't matter, not to Patricia. The next morning, I woke to the deep rumble of heavy machinery. My heart pounded as I ran to the window. A bright yellow bulldozer sat in our driveway, its massive blade gleaming in the early morning sun. Two workers in orange vests stood beside it, measuring the ramp, while Patricia hovered nearby, holding a stack of official-looking papers. I bolted outside, phone in hand, already hitting the record button. "You can't do this!" I shouted. Patricia turned, her face lighting up with fake sympathy. "Oh dear. We sent notice weeks ago. You had time to comply. This is a violation of federal disability laws," I snapped. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The HOA operates independently of city and federal regulations. The bulldozer's engine roared to life. My stomach churned. "This isn't over," I warned, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "You're making a huge mistake." Patricia only smiled, giving the operator a sharp nod. The metal blade lowered toward the ramp with a screech. Concrete cracked. Dust filled the air. And just like that, my sister's lifeline to her own home was reduced to rubble. I barely registered the sound of neighbors gathering, their murmurs of unease growing louder. Someone was recording. Good. I wanted every second of this documented. Then my phone buzzed with a message. "Stay calm. Help is on the way." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. Because what Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my sister wasn't just an ordinary homeowner. She was the governor. And Patricia had just made the biggest mistake of her life. As the dust settled and the last remnants of the wheelchair ramp lay scattered across the driveway, a tense silence spread through the neighborhood. Patricia stood with her arms crossed, clearly pleased with herself, while the workers packed up their tools as if they had just completed an ordinary job. But there was nothing ordinary about what had just happened. The destruction of the ramp wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an attack on my sister's basic rights. My hands were still shaking as I kept my phone steady, recording every detail, making sure to capture Patricia's smug expression and the bulldozer rolling away. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, some stepping outside, whispering among themselves. I could feel their unease, but none of them dared to confront Patricia. They had seen what happened to anyone who got in her way. My phone buzzed again. Another message. ETA, 2 minutes. Keep recording. I swallowed the lump in my throat, knowing that Patricia had no idea what was coming. She was still giving instructions to one of the workers when the first black SUV turned onto our street. Then another. Then 3 more. Their tinted windows and official license plates sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. People straightened up, their curiosity outweighing their hesitation. Patricia's triumphant expression faltered as the lead vehicle came to a stop in front of our house. The doors opened in perfect unison, and uniformed security personnel stepped out, their movements sharp and purposeful. Every whisper, every sound seemed to fade into the background as Emily emerged from the center SUV, her posture commanding even in her wheelchair. The air shifted. Patricia took a step back, her face tightening as she watched Emily approach. My sister had always carried herself with quiet authority, but this was different. She wasn't just my sister right now. She was the governor, and she was here to handle business. The security team flanked her as she moved toward the wreckage of what used to be her ramp. She didn't say anything at first, just surveyed the destruction, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched unbearably, until finally, she turned her gaze toward Patricia. The look in Emily's eyes could have frozen fire. Patricia opened her mouth, perhaps to justify herself, but Emily raised a hand slightly, and she fell silent. There was no need for shouting or threats. The sheer weight of Emily's presence spoke louder than words. I could almost see Patricia's mind racing, piecing together the magnitude of her mistake. She had spent weeks treating Emily as nothing more than an obstacle, a nuisance to be removed, without ever realizing she had been tangling with one of the most powerful figures in the state. A few feet away, one of the state security officers retrieved a folder from the SUV and handed it to Emily. Without looking away from Patricia, she flipped it open, revealing documents that gleamed under the morning light. The hush that had fallen over the street was shattered as Emily spoke, her voice steady, deliberate, and echoing with authority. She didn't raise it, didn't need to, but each word struck like a hammer. Patricia had not only violated federal disability laws, but had also overstepped the legal boundaries of the HOA. The ramp had been built in compliance with state housing regulations, making its removal an unlawful act. Furthermore, the bulldozing had been conducted without a valid court order, which meant Patricia had ordered the destruction of state-approved property without due process. But the worst revelation was still to come. As Emily held up another document, I could see the color drain from Patricia's face. The state legal team had been investigating the HOA's practices for weeks, quietly gathering evidence of financial misconduct, discriminatory enforcement of rules, and multiple complaints filed against Patricia herself. While she had spent years hiding behind the HOA's authority, believing herself untouchable, she had left a paper trail of corruption too damning to ignore. The demolition of the wheelchair ramp had simply accelerated the inevitable. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as people processed what they were hearing. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now exchanged glances, some nodding in understanding. They had all suffered in silence under Patricia's rule, each of them victims in their own way. Patricia's lips parted, but whatever excuse she had prepared crumbled before she could voice it. One of the officers stepped forward, informing her that she was being placed under investigation. Her breath hitched audibly, and for the first time since this battle had begun, she looked truly afraid. The sharp contrast between her arrogance this morning and the uncertainty in her eyes now was almost surreal. She had bulldozed a wheelchair ramp, fully believing she could get away with it. Now she stood at the center of a scandal that would make headlines across the state. Emily didn't linger to watch Patricia's downfall. She turned her attention to the crowd, addressing them not as their neighbor, but as their representative. The destruction of her ramp, she explained, was not just an attack on her, but a symbol of a much larger problem. HOAs across the country had been abusing their power for far too long, using outdated regulations to harass homeowners and discriminate against individuals with disabilities. This incident, as awful as it was, would serve as the catalyst for long overdue change. A wave of agreement passed through the gathered neighbors, their expressions shifting from concern to determination. Even as Patricia was escorted away for questioning, Emily was already looking ahead. She gestured toward the remains of the ramp, calmly instructing her team to begin making arrangements for its reconstruction, this time with full legal protection against any future interference. More than that, she made it clear that the days of unchecked HOA tyranny in this neighborhood were over. The message was received loud and clear. For the first time in years, people stood together, realizing that they no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary rules and petty enforcement. As the last of the official vehicles pulled away and the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, I exhaled, the tension finally leaving my body. Emily rolled her shoulders slightly, a small sign of exhaustion creeping in. She had fought too many battles to let this one break her, but I knew it had taken its toll. Still, as she turned toward me, a small, knowing smile played on her lips. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, at least we had won. The fallout from the HOA's reckless decision spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the afternoon, news vans lined the street, their antennas reaching toward the sky as reporters jostled for position outside our house. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and questions flew in every direction. Journalists weren't just interested in the destruction of the wheelchair ramp. They wanted the full story, the corruption, the abuse of power, and most of all, how Patricia Monroe, the once untouchable HOA president, had gone too far. The footage of the bulldozer tearing down the ramp had already gone viral. Clips of Patricia arrogantly dismissing legal concerns were circulating online, fueling a storm of outrage. People weren't just angry, they were furious. Disability rights activists weighed in, lawyers dissected the legal violations, and homeowners from across the country began sharing their own horror stories about HOA overreach. It wasn't just about us anymore. Inside, Emily was reviewing the growing pile of documents that her legal team had uncovered. What had started as a battle over a single wheelchair ramp had evolved into something much larger. The HOA wasn't just violating laws. They had been systematically targeting specific residents, issuing fines unfairly, and using loopholes to justify their actions. Elderly homeowners, disabled individuals, single parents, and families who didn't conform to Patricia's rigid idea of community standards had all suffered under her rule. The financial records were particularly damning. Hidden fees, inflated violation fines, and questionable transactions showed that Patricia and a select few board members had been funneling HOA funds for personal use under the guise of neighborhood improvements. The same money that was meant to maintain common areas had been quietly redirected to pay for private landscaping, home renovations, and luxury purchases. The deeper Emily's team dug, the worse it got. As evening approached, more neighbors gathered outside, no longer fearful of the consequences of speaking up. It was as if a dam had finally broken. Stories poured out, unfair fines, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions, aggressive letters demanding compliance with vague or selectively enforced rules. The quiet family down the street revealed how Patricia had threatened to remove their backyard playset because it was too colorful and didn't match the neutral tones of the neighborhood. An elderly couple recounted how they had been fined repeatedly for their front yard's unacceptable appearance after they were unable to maintain it due to medical issues. One by one, people came forward, their voices gaining strength as they realized they were not alone. They had all been manipulated into thinking they were powerless. That illusion had finally shattered. Amidst the chaos, Emily remained composed, fielding questions from reporters with the same steady confidence she displayed in press conferences. She explained that what had happened here was not an isolated event, but part of a larger issue that plagued countless communities across the country. Homeowners associations had been created to maintain shared spaces and protect property values, but too often, they had become tools of control, ruled by individuals who abused their authority. She made it clear that reform was not only necessary, but inevitable. This wasn't just about our neighborhood anymore. This was about changing the way HOAs operated at a systemic level. That night, as I scrolled through social media, I saw the momentum building. Hashtags calling for HOA accountability were trending. Legal experts were dissecting the violations Patricia had committed, and disability advocates were rallying behind Emily. Then came the biggest breakthrough. Lawmakers started weighing in. A state senator issued a statement condemning the HOA's actions and promising to push for stronger protections against abuse of power. A prominent civil rights attorney publicly offered to take our case pro bono, ensuring that no legal loophole would allow Patricia or her allies to escape accountability. It was no longer just a local controversy. It was a national conversation. Early the next morning, I stepped outside to find more than just reporters and curious neighbors. Representatives from the State Housing Commission had arrived, briefcases in hand, their expressions serious as they surveyed the neighborhood. They weren't here for interviews. They were here for an investigation. It was clear now that the consequences for Patricia's actions were not going to be limited to public embarrassment or HOA rule changes. Real legal repercussions were coming. When I turned back toward the house, I noticed something that nearly made me laugh. Someone had placed a small handmade sign where the wheelchair ramp had once stood. In bold letters, it read, "Access for all." It was simple but powerful, a quiet statement of defiance against everything Patricia had tried to enforce. The day unfolded like something out of a courtroom drama. Patricia, once confident in her control over the neighborhood, was now scrambling to defend herself. She had called for an emergency HOA board meeting, but it was too late. The board members who had once stood by her side were now distancing themselves as the pressure mounted. Several of them had already resigned, eager to escape the consequences of their involvement. The HOA's legal team was falling apart as well. With financial records under scrutiny and multiple allegations of discrimination stacking up, the organization was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Even Patricia's closest allies were turning against her. When Emily addressed the neighborhood later that afternoon, she didn't talk about revenge or punishment. Instead, she spoke about rebuilding, not just the ramp, but trust, community, and fairness. She proposed the formation of a new HOA board, one that would operate with transparency and accountability. More importantly, she promised that this would not be the last time she fought for homeowner rights. She had already begun drafting a proposal for a statewide bill that would place strict limitations on HOA power, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what we had. Her speech wasn't just met with applause, it was met with commitment. Residents volunteered to help reconstruct the ramp, to push for legal changes, to ensure that this never happened again. The same people who had once been too afraid to challenge Patricia were now stepping up, ready to take back their neighborhood. As the sun set and the last news crew packed up their equipment, I finally felt a sense of closure. The ramp would be rebuilt, the HOA was being dismantled from the inside, and Patricia would face the legal consequences of her actions. But more than that, something bigger had changed. This was no longer just about a single injustice. It was about standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be controlled by those who misuse power. Watching Emily as she spoke with neighbors, planning the next steps, I realized that this battle had never really been about the ramp. It had been about proving that no one, not even the most powerful HOA president, was above the law. The morning after the chaos, the neighborhood felt different. For the first time in years, people weren't looking over their shoulders, dreading the next citation or warning letter. Instead, they were talking, really talking. Conversations happened freely on front lawns. Neighbors who had barely interacted before now, exchanging stories of their own battles with the HOA. It was as if Patricia's reign had kept everyone isolated, afraid to speak out in fear of becoming the next target. But now, the walls of silence had collapsed, and people were beginning to understand just how much power they truly had when they stood together. The investigation into the HOA's practices had moved beyond our neighborhood. Reports of similar abuses in other communities started surfacing, with former residents coming forward to share their own horror stories. Patricia had been at the center of multiple disputes over the years, but each time, she had managed to slip away, using technicalities and loopholes to shield herself from consequences. This time, however, there was nowhere to run. Between the financial misconduct, the violation of disability laws, and the destruction of state-approved property, her legal troubles were mounting by the hour. The final blow came when state investigators uncovered a pattern of fraudulent activity. Fines and fees that had been funneled into personal accounts, contracts awarded to companies with direct ties to Patricia and her allies. What had started as an HOA dispute had now turned into a full-scale legal case, with Patricia facing the possibility of criminal charges. While the legal teams did their work, the community took action in their own way. Plans were immediately put in place to rebuild the wheelchair ramp, and this time, it wouldn't be a quiet, overlooked addition to the house. Instead, it became a symbol of resilience. Volunteers came forward, carpenters, electricians, even local artists offering to contribute. What had once been a simple ramp was being transformed into something extraordinary. A team of painters worked on a mural along the sides, vibrant colors forming images of unity and strength. Solar-powered lights were installed, making it visible at night. Instead of something to be hidden or minimized, it was now a proud statement, a reminder that this neighborhood had changed. Emily wasted no time pushing forward with the larger fight. With the media's attention still focused on the incident, she began meeting with lawmakers to draft new legislation aimed at limiting the unchecked power of HOAs. The proposal, which would eventually be called the Homeowner Protection Act, outlined strict guidelines on how HOAs could enforce rules, ensuring that accessibility requirements, fair treatment, and financial transparency were upheld. It included provisions that would prevent board members from making unilateral decisions without homeowner approval and implemented a legal process to challenge unfair violations. The bill gained traction quickly, with public support pouring in from across the state. It was no longer just about our street. It had become a statewide movement. Meanwhile, Patricia's downfall was accelerating. Her former allies, desperate to save themselves, began leaking emails and documents proving that she had been abusing her position for years. A recorded phone call surfaced in which she blatantly admitted to targeting certain homeowners to keep the neighborhood looking a certain way. That recording alone caused an uproar, confirming what many had suspected but had been too afraid to say aloud. Patricia was no longer just a disgraced HOA president. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale about what happened when power was misused. As the legal battles continued, the neighborhood moved forward. A new HOA board was elected, this time made up of individuals committed to fairness and transparency. The first order of business was rewriting the bylaws, eliminating the vague, selectively enforced rules that Patricia had used to control people. The violation system was overhauled, ensuring that no one could be fined without a clear and justified reason. More importantly, accessibility became a priority rather than an afterthought. Ramps, handrails, and other accommodations were encouraged rather than penalized. The culture of fear that had once defined the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. What surprised me most was how quickly people adapted to the change. It was as if they had been waiting for permission to reclaim their own homes, to live without the constant fear of being watched and judged. Gardens flourished where once they had been restricted. Holiday decorations, once carefully measured and limited, now lit up the streets with creativity and joy. People helped each other with home repairs instead of reporting minor violations. The transformation was more than just physical. It was a shift in mindset. Patricia's house, once the centerpiece of the HOA's strict aesthetic, now stood empty. A for sale sign appeared in the yard, though rumors swirled that she would have a hard time finding a buyer willing to deal with the baggage that came with her name. No one missed her. If anything, her departure felt like the final step in cleansing the neighborhood of its toxic past. Where she had once stood, dictating every minor detail of people's lives, there was now only an empty space, a reminder of what had been and what would never be again. The biggest victory, however, wasn't just in the changes to our neighborhood or the policies being rewritten at the state level. It was in the way people carried themselves now. No longer afraid, no longer passive. They had seen firsthand what collective action could accomplish. They had learned that power, even when concentrated in the wrong hands, could always be challenged. The story of what happened here was being shared across the country, a beacon for other communities struggling under similar oppression. If we could fight back, so could they. As the final touches were put on Emily's new wheelchair ramp, she wheeled herself up for the first time, pausing at the top to take in the view. The street looked the same as it always had, but everything felt different. The fear, the control, the oppression, it was all gone. In its place was something stronger. A community that had learned to stand together, to fight for what was right, and to never let power go unchecked again. As weeks passed, the effects of what had happened continued to ripple outward. The media coverage didn't die down as quickly as some had expected. News outlets kept running stories about HOA corruption, inviting legal experts and homeowners from across the country to share their experiences. What had started as a single act of injustice had turned into a national discussion about abuse of power, discrimination, and the unchecked authority of homeowners associations. Every day, new testimonies emerged. Families who had been threatened with foreclosure over trivial violations, veterans forced to remove wheelchair ramps, parents fined for putting up a child's basketball hoop. Emily's case had become the spark that set everything in motion, and she knew it. She didn't just let the momentum carry her. She drove it forward with relentless determination. The Homeowner Protection Act gained widespread support. Politicians who had previously ignored the issue suddenly wanted to be involved, eager to align themselves with what had become one of the most publicized legislative pushes of the year. Disability rights groups, housing advocates, and legal organizations rallied behind the bill, ensuring it had the backing it needed to pass. The final version not only introduced strict regulations on how HOAs could operate, but also included protections that prevented them from violating federal accessibility laws. It became illegal for an HOA to deny a homeowner the right to make necessary accommodations for medical or mobility needs. The penalties for noncompliance were severe, ensuring that no future HOA president could do what Patricia had done without facing immediate consequences. The bill passed with overwhelming support, and when Emily sat before the cameras to sign it into law, she didn't just do it as a governor. She did it as someone who had lived through the very injustice it was designed to prevent. Back in our neighborhood, the transformation was complete. The new HOA, under the leadership of reasonable, community-minded individuals, functioned the way it was always meant to. Instead of an organization obsessed with control, it became a resource for residents. Volunteers helped elderly homeowners with yard maintenance instead of fining them for overgrown grass. Families that had once felt unwelcome were now active members of a community that finally understood what it meant to support one another. The petty restrictions and absurdly rigid rules were gone, replaced by a structure that actually served the people who lived there. It was no longer about power. It was about cooperation. The ramp had become more than just a structure. People from neighboring communities came to see it, drawn in by the story behind it. School groups, disability advocates, and even local government officials stopped by, using it as an example of what could happen when people stood up against injustice. The mural painted along its sides had become a symbol of resilience, its colors a reminder of the battle that had been fought and won. What once had been an eyesore in Patricia's eyes was now the most celebrated feature in the entire neighborhood. One evening, as Emily and I sat outside watching the sunset, the quiet hum of conversation filled the air. Kids played in front yards without fear of getting citations for leaving toys on the lawn. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now shared meals and laughter. It was a peacefulness we hadn't known in years. Emily leaned back in her wheelchair, her eyes scanning the street, taking in the sight of the neighborhood she had helped reclaim. She had fought bigger battles before, passed major laws, handled political crises, but this, she admitted, was different. This had been personal. As I glanced toward Patricia's old house, now sold to a young family with 3 children, I couldn't help but smile. The new owners had installed a wheelchair ramp for their elderly grandmother, one that no one would ever try to remove. No violation notices, no harassment, no power-hungry dictator to tear it down in the name of property values. Instead, 5 neighbors had shown up on move-in day to help carry boxes. It was the kind of neighborhood it was always meant to be. Emily had changed the laws, but more importantly, she had changed the people. She had proven that no one was above accountability and that injustice, no matter how small, was always worth fighting against. And as I sat there, watching the streetlights flicker on, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Because if one neighborhood could change, then so could the next, and the next after that. One ramp, one fight, and an entire system forever transformed.